Okay, so hopefully we'll have a few other people pop in and join us, but I will go ahead and get started. So my name is Benjamin Ruisch, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Kent. First and foremost, I'll say thank you and welcome, and thanks for joining us here today. I know there are a lot of ways that you could have chosen to spend this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are, so I appreciate you dropping by to check out this talk. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is about some of my research, and I'm going to show you some of the tools that I use to conduct it. Of course, there are a lot of psychologists at Kent doing very exciting research on wildly different topics, but my talk today will give you kind of a little window into some of the work that we do here. So I'm a political psychologist, which means that I study people's political cognition and behavior. So what shapes the political attitudes that they hold? What leads them to vote one way or another? Questions like this. And in particular, in my work, I focus a lot on how differences between people in the way that our physical bodies function and perform, so differences in our physiology and how people's bodies respond in different situations, influence the political attitudes that we form and the way that we feel about different social groups. And today I'll talk to you just for about half an hour about some of this work. But to get us started, though, I want to give you just a bit of background so that you understand the kinds of broader concerns that motivate my research. So as you may be aware, the divide between the political left and right is growing in many nations around the globe, with increasing polarization, growing animosity, and less willingness to engage in dialogue with those of the opposing ideology. In many countries, this political divide now elicits levels of explicit antipathy, explicit hatred that can even outpace differences based on race or religion or social class. On the one side of this divide, we have a group of people who call themselves conservative or right-wing, and conservatives tend to be more concerned with maintaining order and structure and stability in society. They tend to believe that immigration should be kept to a minimum. They support harsher punishments for criminals and more aggressive foreign policy strategies. And they tend to be more opposed to welfare policies and other means of distributing societal wealth. On the other side of this divide, of course, we have people who call themselves progressive or left-wing, or in a few countries like the US, liberals. And progressives tend to be more open to social change and to be less concerned with maintaining order. They also tend to be more open to immigration and to support more lenient punishment and more cooperative foreign policy strategies, and to be more supportive of wealth redistribution. Okay. So although this is a simplification of how political attitudes work, this single dimension of left and right, or progressive and conservative, captures a lot of the way the people's political attitudes work, a lot of the variety in political attitudes. And importantly, this left-right divide isn't limited only to the UK or even only to Western nations. Rather, this dimension of progressive versus conservative seems to have been relatively consistent across time and across different cultures. And in the modern day, it's something that we see manifesting in some form across numerous nations around the globe. So here you can see some of the names that are used for the left and right in some of the nations where I've been conducting my own work. And for decades, psychologists have been asking themselves, why? Why do some people hold more progressive sets of beliefs and others are more conservatives? What explains this deep-rooted divide between the left and right? And you can probably guess some of the reasons why, right? Perhaps people's political attitudes are instilled at an early age from their parents or from their friend groups, or maybe the political attitudes depend on how much money they have, right? Some people have more money and they want to protect it from taxation, while others have less, and so they're more supportive of government welfare programs. Or maybe their attitudes depend on other life experiences that they've had. For example, maybe some people are more progressive because they've had close friends who are immigrants, or because they themselves are immigrants. These kinds of factors we psychologists often call environmental or situational factors, since they all relate to the kinds of situations that people have been in. And you probably heard the terms nature versus nurture, kind of describing this divide as well. And everything that I just mentioned falls into the category of nurture, because it's all related to the experiences that a person has had over the course of their lives. And research shows that all of these environmental factors matter. The parents that a person had, the friends that they had, how much money they have, all of these things help to explain why some people are more progressive and others are more conservative. But these kinds of environmental factors aren't the whole story. And instead, what my research and the work of a lot of my colleagues has increasingly shown is that a big part of our political attitudes are shaped by our genetics and our biology. So the genes we have, the way that our physical bodies respond to different situations, the way we physically perceive and experience the world, all of this shapes what we think about politics. So it's a big part of what determines whether we're open to immigration or whether we want to close our borders. It's what determines whether we support welfare or whether we want people to have to work for their money. All of these really complex social beliefs seem to be rooted in large part in our biological makeup. And it might even be the case, some recent research suggests, that these biological factors might be more important than the environmental factors. So, for example, it's been estimated that 40 to 60% of the variance in where a person falls on this left-right spectrum is determined by a person's genetics. That's amazing, right? So how is this possible? Well, it seems that different kinds of genetic makeups are associated with different kinds of brains and different kinds of physical bodies and different forms of physiological responding. And so by physiological responding here, I'm just referring to the way that your brain and body react chemically, electrically, and physically in different situations. So for example, the way that your body and brain respond to something threatening or something exciting or something that tastes and smells pleasant is all shaped by your genetics and biology. And believe it or not, these different physiological responses also shape the way that you think about politics. And so a lot of my research has been focused on uncovering the different physiological factors that shape our political attitudes. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about two broad areas of research that I've been conducting on the physiological underpinnings of political ideology, focusing on sensitivity to threat and taste sensitivity. And as I talk to you about this work, I'm going to show you some of the specific tools and techniques that I use to conduct it. And this is the kind of research that you would have the chance to get involved in Kent, both as a research participant as well as conducting your own research as part of your final year project. Okay, so let me start off by talking about the first of these two broad dimensions, this first kind of critical driver of political and intergroup attitudes, which is the way that people respond to threat or stress. And you've probably heard of the fight or flight response, right? That refers to the set of physical reactions that our body has when we're faced with threatening situations. Our heart starts pounding, our palms get sweaty, our mind starts racing, our breathing becomes faster, and all of our muscles tense up. Basically, our body gears up to either fight the thing that's threatening us or to run away and avoid it, right? And all typically developing humans have this set of fight or flight reactions, but the strength of this response differs a lot between people. So to illustrate this, imagine that you're walking down a dark alley, it's late, it's the middle of the night, it's pitch black out, there's no one around, your eyes are kind of straining to pick up anything in the dark, your ears are wide open and listening for anything that might be threatening, and then suddenly you hear a loud noise, right? Almost anyone in this situation will show a fight or flight response, but the degree of this response is going to differ a lot between people. So at one end of this spectrum, we have people who will jump a little bit, but recover more or less immediately and then assess whether there's really anything to be worried about. Other people, though, will come close to having a full-on panic attack. Their hearts will start pounding, they'll hear a rushing sound in their ears, they might even take off running before they consciously realize what happened. Well, these differences are rooted, at least in part, in our biology. Some of us tend to have far stronger reactions to threat and others much milder ones. And what's fascinating about this, to psychologists like myself, is that these differences seem to have a lot of downstream implications for how we think and how we respond to the social and political world. And in my work, for example, I find that people who have stronger reactions to threat tend to adopt more politically conservative views over the course of their lives. And I'll talk to you in a few minutes about why this seems to be the case. But first, I want to show you kind of how we measure these differences. So how do we, as political psychologists, collect the data that lead to these kinds of discoveries? I see some questions coming in on the chat, and I think maybe just for the sake of continuity, I'll save them to the end, but we'll have time for a Q&A, both via chat and in real time. Cool. Okay, so basically, when we want to see how sensitive someone is to threat, what we want to do is capture the different components of this fight or flight reaction and see how strong they are for a given person. And there are several ways that we do this. So the first measure that we use is called skin conductance. So what is skin conductance? Basically, it's a fancy way of assessing how much sweat there is in your skin. So you remember when we were talking about the different components of the fight or flight response a second ago, one of the common elements is this feeling of sweaty palms. And that's because when we get kind of physiologically aroused, when we start to get sort of amped up, our body immediately starts secreting sweat. And what skin conductance measures is the amount of this subcutaneous sweat by testing how easily electrical current passes through your skin. And this gives us a nice kind of moment-to-moment measure of how physiologically aroused you are. So to measure this, we'll typically use a simple pair of electrodes, usually placed on the hand, on the two fingers you can see here in the photograph. We can also measure this with wearable devices so that people can be moving about freely as they're participating in the study. And so these electrodes and this little machine they're attached to are just going to record people's skin conductance and thus their physiological arousal and how this is changing as they're completing the different tasks in the study. At the same time, we'll also be collecting heart rate information because, as you remember, an increased heart rate is a second major physiological indicator of the fight or flight response. So to collect heart rate information, we'll typically use a chest strap monitor or an armband, or by placing electrodes on the chest, like in the photograph here. And this records how fast someone's heart is beating, as well as a lot of other kind of corollary dimensions of cardiac response. And then finally, the kind of third major dimension of the fight or flight response that we tend to look at is what are called the startle blink. And what startle blink captures is this immediate kind of reflexive squinting of the eye that happens when something pops out and surprises you, right? And this is an evolutionarily designed reflex to protect your very vulnerable and very valuable eyes. But it's also something that varies a lot from person to person. So to measure the degree of this startle blink response, we hook up a couple of additional electrodes to the orbicularis oculi muscle that rings the eye, and we'll measure the electrical current that's output for the contraction of this muscle. So in the typical lab setup, we'll hook people up to all this recording equipment, and then we'll expose them to different triggers of threat. This can be images, for example, like a snake about to strike, or a close-up image of a spider. Generally, we'll also toss in some non-threatening images like this fluffy bunny here, just to kind of keep people on their toes. There can also be unexpected loud noises, anything to kind of trigger this threat response. In some studies, we'll even use other kind of unpleasant or threatening stimuli like electric shock to really elicit this state of physiological threat. And then, of course, we measure how a person's body responds when they're exposed to these threats. And so this part is a bit technical, but I can show you what these data actually look like when they're coming in. So this shows the skin conductance data from one research participant. So along the bottom here, what we call the x-axis is time. So the start of the experiment is kind of represented off on the far left, and as time progresses, it moves off to the right, as you see happening here. And so this is what we see when someone first comes in and sits down for the study, and the data kind of start rolling in. And so the top three panels here show the skin conductance response. And you see that so far things are pretty stable, basically, because nothing is really happening in the experiment yet. But if we fast forward a little bit, we can see the skin conductance response to threat. So these little blocks that pop up on the fourth panel from the top, these represent the points at which the images are presented. And the other three panels above, again, show the skin conductance response. So the changes in physiological arousal that are actually occurring during the study. And even looking at this with the naked eye, you can see that most of the time these images get presented, there's this pretty immediate skin conductance response. And some people show really major spikes, while other people show really small spikes. The person here I would probably characterize as being sort of somewhere in the middle. And as I mentioned before, these differences in threat response, right? So whether you're showing a big spike or a small spike, kind of a really intense physiological reaction or a really weak one, I think fascinatingly relate to the political attitudes that a person forms. And in particular, it seems that people who are more sensitive to threat tend to be more politically conservative, while those who are less sensitive to threat tend to be more politically progressive. So in other words, the people who jump halfway out of their skin when they're walking down that dark alley, or who show these big spikes in skin conductance and heart rate when they're participating in our lab studies, and they hear a burst of white noise or a big threatening image, they also tend to be the ones who are most politically conservative. So why is this? Well, it seems that if you're someone who is very sensitive to threat, you tend to have a greater preference for stability and certainty and familiarity and safety. This makes sense, right? Probably because stability and predictability help kind of manage threat and danger in one's environment. And this preference, kind of general preference for stability, is likely to lead you towards conservatism, since conservatism tends to prioritize a lot of these values. For example, by protecting and defending the current state of society, and by taking a harsher stance towards criminals and other wrongdoers. Conversely, being oriented towards social change, especially big, risky changes, the way that progressives often are, is a lot easier when you're less sensitive to threat. Basically, if a risk doesn't feel as risky, if it doesn't feel as threatening, then you're more willing to take this leap and try something new. In talking about this, though, I think it's really important to note that neither one of these responses is correct or better than the other. I think in the modern day, we like to think that at least, under some conditions, it might be better to have kind of a less intense threat response. But it's important to remember that this response protects us from danger, and it's a product of millions of years of evolution. And ultimately, people who have this kind of weaker threat response are likely to be more vulnerable to dangers, whether it was getting eaten by a lion on the savannah 100,000 years ago or getting mugged in a dark alley today. So both of these kinds of physiological profiles have their strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so we see this association between threat sensitivity and political conservatism, but there are a lot of other psychological consequences of higher sensitivity to threat. So for example, there's evidence that it can also influence traits like neuroticism and openness to new experiences, so even kind of shaping our personality. And if a person is extremely sensitive to threat, this can even manifest in greater anxiety or other kinds of mental health problems. So although the main focus of my work is on political and intergroup attitudes, other people, including some other folks here at Kent, use these physiological measures for looking at a range of different kinds of traits. Okay, so the degree to which our bodies respond to threat can play a significant role in our psychology, right? From mental illness to personality, even our political ideologies. And these kinds of discoveries led me to start wondering about what other traits and features of our physical bodies might shape our attitudes. And in my more recent research, one thing that I've been looking at a lot is sensory sensitivity. So you're probably familiar with the 5 primary senses of taste, smell, touch, sight, and hearing. And as I'm sure you learned growing up, all typically developing humans share kind of a similar set of sensory equipment. For example, rods and cones in our eyes to receive light, touch receptors that allow us to perceive sensations on the skin, etc. But what we often don't hear so much about is that people actually vary a lot in their degree of sensory sensitivity as well. So while some people tend to experience sensory sensitivity, sensory experiences kind of more weakly, others tend to have far more intense experiences. So this is true in specific domains. For example, some people seem to have a very sensitive sense of smell, others far less so. But there's also some evidence that some people are more sensitive kind of across domains, tending to exhibit greater sensitivity to all sensory stimuli. And similarly to the case of threat, what makes this interesting to psychologists like myself is that these differences in sensory sensitivity can have some important downstream implications for our psychology. And so in my own work, I've focused primarily on the domains of touch, taste, and smell. But just for the sake of time today, I'm going to focus kind of in on this sensitivity to taste. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's evidence that people can vary in their sensitivity in all of the sensory domains. But this variation is perhaps nowhere more pronounced than in the domain of taste or gustation. So specifically, while some people seem to have very sensitive senses of taste, flavors are experienced with much greater intensity. Other people have far less sensitive senses of taste, tending to experience kind of flavor sensations more mildly. And these differences have implications for things like the kinds of food that we like to eat, but even for our personality and our political preferences. But before I get into that, I want to kind of give you an idea of how we go about testing these kinds of questions in the lab. So one of the most common methods of assessing taste sensitivity is with using taste strips. You might have had these in a science class growing up, but basically what you do is you give people a taste strip like the one here, and they're instructed to just place this strip on the top of their tongue for about 10 seconds. After this, they rate the intensity of the flavor that they experience on a scale from 0, or no sensation at all, to 100, or the strongest imaginable sensation of any kind. And these taste strips contain the chemical 6N-propylthiouracil, or PROP. And PROP is this peculiar chemical for which there's a great deal of individual variance in people's ability to taste. And what makes this interesting is that the ability to taste PROP maps on well to general taste sensitivity, which makes PROP kind of this convenient and effective test for assessing a person's general level of taste sensitivity. Just to give you kind of quick digression on exactly how this works, in case you're curious. So although the factors that determine sensitivity to PROP, as well as taste sensitivity more generally, aren't fully understood yet by science, people generally fall into 3 broad categories of taste sensitivity, depending on their genetic makeup. So basically, the way that it works is there's this pair of alleles on the taste receptor TAS2R38 that control the ability to taste PROP, and which are also related to general taste sensitivity. So people who inherit 2 recessive non-taster alleles fall into the first category here, who we refer to as non-tasters. So these people are kind of lowest on the taste sensitivity spectrum. They lack the ability to taste PROP, and they're kind of lower in all-around taste sensitivity. So for these people, the PROP taste strip pretty much just tastes like a regular piece of paper. Those with 1 dominant taster allele and 1 recessive non-taster allele fall into the category that we call simply tasters. And so tasters can taste PROP, but they experience only a mild degree of bitterness from it. And their general sensitivity to taste seems to follow a similar pattern. They can taste kind of a broader range of flavors than can non-tasters, but not to the same degree of intensity as those who we call super tasters. And super tasters are those with 2 dominant taster alleles, so 1 inherited from each parent, and they can not only taste PROP, but they experience an intensely bitter flavor from it. And their perceptions of the intensity of flavors in food is kind of similarly strong, with their palates being far more sensitive than people in the first 2 categories. And as I noted, where you fall on this taste sensitivity spectrum, surprisingly, has implications for your behavior and your psychology. So perhaps most importantly, and most obviously, our sense of taste has implications for how we eat, what we like to eat, what our preferences are in kind of the culinary realm. And this connection, I think, feels pretty obvious and intuitive, right? But it's worth noting that a lot of people's intuitions about the nature of this relationship are wrong. So you might imagine that those with higher taste sensitivity would enjoy food more, since they would be better equipped to kind of experience the full range of possible flavors. But research suggests that this isn't actually the case. And if anything, the relationship is the opposite. So it seems to be the case that people with higher levels of taste sensitivity seem to be more prone to having bad experiences with food. So the bitter and the sour and the spicy flavors that might be enjoyable to someone lower on the taste sensitivity spectrum end up being too intense for people who are high in taste sensitivity. And as a result, they end up avoiding these kinds of flavors. Conversely, those at the lower end of the taste sensitivity spectrum tend to have fewer of these unpleasantly intense sensations, and so they're generally more exploratory when it comes to food. And so ultimately, the relationship between taste sensitivity and food preferences is such that less sensitive people tend to be open to eating more kind of exotic and less familiar cuisines, while those who are more sensitive tend to eat, more tried and true kind of meat and potato type meals, simply because more intense and unfamiliar tastes tend to be particularly aversive to them. Okay, but even though the direction of this connection between taste sensitivity and food preferences might be surprising, it makes sense that there would be a link between how we taste and what we like to eat, right? But what about beyond the culinary realm? Well, I mentioned before, my research has shown that taste sensitivity actually also predicts other psychological traits and characteristics well beyond food. And perhaps shockingly, this includes political attitudes as well. And so specifically what my collaborators and I have found in our research is that people with more sensitive senses of taste on average tend to be more politically conservative. And when we first discovered this connection, needless to say, we were also pretty surprised. And we wondered, first of all, okay, so maybe it's the case that conservatives just report having more sensitive senses of taste, right? After all, even though sensitivity to prop has been shown to be rooted in a person's genetics, it's still the case that people have to self-report their subjective experiences of how intense this taste is on this scale, right? So we wondered, maybe it's the case that conservatives just say their experiences are more intense than progressives are. So to rule this out, we wanted to kind of find a more objective measure of taste sensitivity. And fortunately, one exists. So if I asked a few of you to turn on your cameras, open your mouths and press your tongues against your webcams, this is more or less what we would see, right? And if you look really closely, you can notice little round spots on these people's tongues. And they show up even more clearly if you first stain a person's tongue blue. And so these little bumps are called fungiform papilla. And fungiform papilla are the primary location of taste buds on the tongue. So basically, the more of these fungiform papilla a person has, the more taste buds they have, and the more sensitive their sense of taste is. So we wondered, would we find a similar pattern of results if instead of using taste strips, we actually examined the density of fungiform papilla on people's tongues? And so we ran a study to test this, right? So we first set up a table on campus, kind of hung up this little adorable cat banner here to kind of lure people into taking part of our study. Whereupon we dyed their tongues using blue food coloring, isolated a small area with a white plastic ring, and then photographed their tongues using a macro lens and a high-resolution camera, which allowed us to assess fungiform papilla density. And shockingly, we found that even using this more objective metric of taste sensitivity, fungiform papilla density, we found this same relationship. So people with more sensitive senses of taste tend to be more politically conservative, while those with less sensitive senses of taste tend to be more politically progressive. And in our other more recent research, we've been digging into the question of why, right? That's the big question here. Why would this be the case? Why would sensory sensitivity be associated with greater conservatism? And by the way, we found this to be true not only in the domain of taste, but we also have some evidence that the same is true of olfactory or smell sensitivity, as well as interoceptive sensitivity, which is sensitivity to the kind of internal states and processes of one's own physical body. And what I found here is that stronger physiological sensations seem to have a disproportionate effect on judgments and behavior. So for example, bad flavors and pain and feelings of disgust are all experienced more acutely by those who are more sensorially sensitive. And this leads these individuals to place kind of greater trust on their intuition or their gut feelings, to be more sensitive to disgusting situations and stimuli, and to be less open to new experiences, all of which in turn lead them to be more likely to adopt more politically conservative versus progressive views. Okay, so I want to leave time for questions and kind of chatting. So I'm gonna cut it here and just end with this kind of having given you this relatively quick overview on these two broad domains of physiological responding, threat sensitivity and taste sensitivity, and how they seem to shape political ideology. So hopefully this gave you kind of an interesting taste of the kinds of research that we do at Kent and the different tools and techniques that we use. So with that, I'll just kind of end it and maybe open things up for questions so that we can hopefully get kind of a chat going.
Lovely, thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat, or if you feel comfortable enough, please pop your camera on and you can ask Ben yourself. If we start with the one in the chat at the moment, what countries have you conducted research in, and are the conclusions drawn about physiology determining political attitudes similar or different?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's a big question, and it's a question that kind of as a field we're tackling right now. So as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm American. I did my grad school and postdoc in the US before going to the Netherlands and now to the UK. But most of the data that I've personally collected on physiology and on taste sensitivity and on these different kind of sensory sensitivities that I talked about are from the US. But we have been kind of expanding this research recently. So we just conducted a series of studies in the Netherlands, which seem to show a relatively similar pattern of results. I'll say that the specific form that political attitudes take differs a bit from country to country, right? If you think about the US, things like gun control and abortion are really hot button issues. In the Netherlands, they aren't things that are discussed kind of in the political realm at all. But when you strip away the kind of this, I think what I would call sort of extraneous differences in terms of the specific political issues, we do still generally tend to find a really consistent pattern of relations between the kinds of physiological and cognitive traits that we look at and this kind of position on this broad left-right spectrum. I'll say that so far, almost everything that I've done or that anyone has done has been limited to Western European nations and the US and maybe a bit of work in Australia. So we haven't gotten kind of beyond this relatively limited sample yet, but that's kind of the next, I think, big step in the field is to start collecting data and to see to what degree this really does manifest globally. Yeah, one final thing, but so that's true of the physiological data. But a lot of the other work that I do is on kind of left-right differences kind of cognitively. And these are things that we can do a little more easily online. And with these online samples, so differences in the way that people think and the way that people respond to stimuli and reaction times and things like that, there we've looked across a wide range of countries. So in one of those early slides, I showed you some of the names for the left and right in Turkey, in Indonesia, in Chile, in the Netherlands, Finland. These are all countries where we've kind of replicated successfully a lot of these core differences between the left and right. Yeah.
Fantastic. Does anybody else have any other questions? And I must put it out there, no question is a silly question. If you're intrigued at all, please feel free to pop it in the chat or turn your microphone on.
And or feel free to email me after the fact. If you're not able to gather your thoughts to pop one in the comment thread now, feel free to just send an email too.
We will give it a moment just in case anybody is typing. Take that as no more questions.
Maybe so, but
Yeah.
but like I said, feel free to email or just say hi, or did something pop up?
Yeah, we've got one. So would you say that the difference in taste levels account for the ethnic variation in conservative and progressive parties? I assume that's it.
That's interesting. So that seems not to be the case. So that's an interesting way of phrasing the question. So a lot of when we thought about this, because we're of course aware, and you must have some, I think, exposure to kind of the construct of taste sensitivity, if you're aware, as I think a lot of people probably are not, kind of going in, that there are ethnic differences too, and these kind of vary globally around the world in some really interesting ways. As a slight digression, I'll say they vary in some really interesting ways, especially when you look at different cuisines, right? So it looks kind of at the global level. There are particular areas and particular kind of ethnicities where people have kind of lower taste sensitivity on average. And these also tend to be places where people eat spicier cuisines, for example. And so there's these kind of intriguing relationships that you see both kind of across ethnicity and how these kind of interlace with cultural differences and things like that. So when we start talking about these or start worrying about these things or being concerned with like the kind of ethnic differences, it was just to make sure that they wouldn't explain the differences between liberals and conservatives that we found, right? So we tend to think about these things as potential confounds, right? So if it's the case that among liberals, there are a lot of people from a particular ethnic group, and that particular ethnic group also tends to be less taste sensitive, then that could explain the liberal conservative differences. So because of that possibility, we were very cautious. I think in the studies that we ran in the taste sensitivity studies, we had, a list of possible ethnicities that have about 27 different options just to make sure we got the most kind of nuanced data that we possibly could. That in no way explained the differences. And if anything, it seemed like it maybe kind of worked against the kind of general differences between liberals and conservatives that we found. So when we kind of statistically adjusted for those things, the differences became even bigger between the left and right. But in a way that sort of answers the question. So it seems that the differences in ethnicity and the kind of relationships between ethnicity and taste sensitivity, these kind of like intercorrelations, don't intercorrelate in such a way that they explain either the differences between liberals and conservatives in taste sensitivity, or, well, yeah, effectively that. So intriguingly, that seems not to be the case, but you've hit upon something I think that is really fascinating, right? These kinds of these ethnic variety and the way that taste sensitivity seems to kind of differ around the globe. And what I think would be interesting would be to look at, right, whether, we know that different cultures, for example, have different ideologies. In a sense, some cultures are kind of more culturally conservative, and some cultures are kind of more culturally progressive. And to look at whether can we see kind of at the global level, right, that ethnicities and things like that we know that are kind of lower in taste sensitivity, whether those also happen to be the kind of cultures that are more progressive, right? Because this would be, in a way, some kind of convergent evidence for this kind of association between taste sensitivity and political ideology, but at the global scale. That's something we don't have the data to tackle now, I think, but would be a really interesting question for future research.
Fantastic. I think something also really interesting someone just asked is, do you know if the research participants included both neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals? I was wondering if there would be any differences.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So in most of our studies, we don't have any kind of limitations on who can participate. So we just open them up to whoever's around. A lot of the studies are done online, not the case of the taste sensitivity studies, of course, or the physiological studies. But when we run those studies, we'll typically recruit either from college campuses, or most of the time we try to kind of reach out to people in the local community too, to make sure that we're getting kind of a more diverse sample than just students. So we don't have any restrictions. So, likely we had both kind of neurotypical and neurodiverse participants in our samples, but just statistically, it's unlikely, I think, that we would have detected differences if they were there. I think, just given the fact that we're likely to have a lot more kind of neurotypical people in our samples, and this would sort of wash out kind of the effects of if they were sort of different among people who are kind of neurodiverse. But it's a really interesting question. It's a question I have no answer for whatsoever, and no one has ever looked at. I can tell you with virtual certainty, but it's really interesting. And I think the answer would be probably that it depends on specifically what form of neurodiversity you're talking about, right? And I think, if we're talking about, this is really going in the realm of wild speculation, but if we talk about, let's say, particular forms of autism, maybe where people tend to, let's say, make decisions in kind of a more top-down kind of cognitive manner, in a much kind of more detached and reasoned and rational way, versus the way that a lot of humans think about politics, like a lot of neurotypical humans think about politics, which is very much kind of guided by the gut. That's where you might start to see kind of divergence, I think. So if you have someone that's basing their opinions maybe a little bit less on gut feelings and a little bit more on, okay, so what's like a rational decision in this context? That's where we might see that these kinds of low-level physiological traits are a little less important, right? Because if you're someone that doesn't trust your guts, if you're someone that doesn't kind of operate by emotion, then you wouldn't expect these differences to play much of a role in structuring your political attitudes. Anyway, but like I said, that's pretty much a speculation, but it's a really interesting question for the future, I think.
And then the final one we have is, do genetics alter the difference in taste levels?
Yeah, so it seems that genetics, kind of genetic differences between people largely explain the differences in taste sensitivity that we are kind of examining here. So in the case of fungiform papilla density, that seems to be very much genetically determined. And it's also something that's relatively kind of insensitive to situational factors. There's not much that you can do to kind of rub those little bumps off your tongue. They're pretty much there for life. When it comes to things like sensitivity to flavors more generally, there seems to be a little bit more variability. Kind of taste sensitivity can kind of decline with age. There's some evidence of that. But yeah, but in general, in large part, taste sensitivity seems to be rooted in kind of genetic differences, even though we kind of scientists don't know entirely what differences, right? So in the case of PROP, like I showed you, it's a relatively simple story. That's this TAS2R38 kind of allele that determines whether you're sensitive to PROP. But prop is just one very specific chemical compound, right? It has a bitter flavor, but I think there are 32 different kinds of bitter flavors that the human tongue can detect. And that's not even touching on, sweet and sour and salty flavors and things like that. So taste is immensely complex. Most kinds of taste are much more multiply determined genetically than prop sensitivity is. And so it's a question that we can say kind of heritability wise. It seems that taste sensitivity is largely genetically determined, but we don't yet know what are the genes that kind of affect all of these different aspects of taste sensitivity. Anyway, hopefully that's that kind of rambling answer hit it what you're kind of interested in there. But yeah, thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think that's all of the questions. I'm sure they would have come through while answering those ones. So thank you so much for your time. And all of you applicants as well. If you have any questions at all, you have my email from earlier when I emailed you all. Otherwise, you can reach out to Benjamin as well. Are you happy for me to put your email address?
Yeah, please.
Chat. Lovely. Yeah. And yeah, we hope to see you all choose Kent and join us in September.
Indeed.
But thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everyone.